Welcome to Beyond the Dollar Signs with your host, Mark Taylan. Mark, it's good to be with you. How are you?
Hi, Bill. It's great to see you again.
It's really, really good to see you. And you're going to be talking about a topic today that I know affects a lot of people, even those nowhere near close to retiring. But the subject of retirement can cause a lot of people a lot of concerns right away. So let's just dive into the topic. And why don't you tell us, what are the greatest concerns from your experience as a financial advisor that people have about retiring?
Yeah, people are really nervous about this topic. You know, there was a recent survey done, and really kind of the top four things that people were concerned about when it comes to this topic was, one, outliving their savings, right? Two, inflation. Expenses are really high. Obviously, everybody knows, you know, the cost of milk or eggs is much more expensive these days than it was years ago. Healthcare in retirement, right? People are concerned, and they're seeing, you know, other families deal with healthcare challenges where maybe, you know, later down in life, they've got to come out with an enormous amount of expense, you know, they've got an enormous expense and wondering how are they going to cover that with their assets that they've got. And finally, you know, they're concerned about also the stability of their, you know, income, Social Security and pension. Will that continue? Will it be enough? Those tend to be the biggest concerns that people walk in my office with anyway.
No, that's fair. So let's start this conversation by asking you, what do you think clients should focus on as they prepare for retirement?
I think it's a great question. You know, many times I think people used to think, you know, it's a certain number. People would talk about, you know, there was a commercial that was done years ago, and it was people walking around with dollar signs and a certain number, and the commercial was, what's your number? And I think that's part of the story, but I think what people really need to focus on is the income in retirement. How, you know, the income for what you need, which is, you know, your base expenses, and then in retirement, the income for things that you want. What kind of retirement do you want? Do you want to travel? Do you want to take the grandkids to Disney World? You know, do you want to pick up hobbies and those type of things? So a number is important, but how does that number really translate into generating income? Because you're about to embark on the next stage of your life. And if you're retiring in your 60s, and most people, when we run financial plans, we're forecasting to in the 90s, right? So you're talking about a 30-year retirement, and you're ready to take that move. But how comfortable are you that you're going to have the income to, you know, to do that?
Oh man, I know, and I know that people are retiring later and later in life because of this very concern, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of them walk into the office, in my office, and they just don't know. They don't know if they can do it. Yeah. They just can't see it, right? And they have to go through a process, and I think that's very important.
So one of the things that I know you and I've talked about is you talk about prioritizing income protection, which is an interesting sounding phrase, but to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure I understand what it means. What do you mean by that?
Well, when you think about income protection, there are certain types of income that have guarantees behind them, right? Number one, Social Security. Right. When you draw Social Security, that's backed by the government. And so you hope that's a sustainable thing, right? But everybody talks, well, will Social Security last? If you've got a pension, what type of pension is it, and who guarantees that pension? And when you're thinking about your investments, if you've got pensions or 401ks, 403bs, retirement accounts, what are those accounts, and how do you position those to provide income that's stable in retirement? And there's many ways to solve this. And you know, clients have a lot of options when it comes to choosing and choosing the type of investment vehicle and strategy to have protected income, right? And so I would compare protected income, that's one side of it. And then, of course, you have income that's growth oriented, like stocks as an example, right?
Yeah. So income protection's only one part of the equation. Obviously the other part of the equation is budgeting. And so how do you advise people in terms of when you sit down with them and they're looking at retirement in a real way? How do you encourage them to look at their budgets and set their budgets so that they know what kind of number they're looking for?
A lot of times I'll ask clients, I want you to go home and take a look at your expenses. If you currently, track them on a spreadsheet. If you don't, it's really good to sit down and look at those numbers, and not only just your baseline expenses. Maybe it's your mortgage, car payments, insurance. All of those things are important. Your household discretionary things, like what are you spending, for food, and how often do you go out? But I think what a lot of people miss, and they'll bring me their expenses and they'll say, "Hey, Mark, we spend $6,000 to $7,000 a month." And as I look at those expenses, I often see, well, what you're probably missing is things like home repairs, discretionary expenses, hobbies, things like that. Birthdays and Christmas, those expenses can get away from you in retirement. And if you're on a fixed income, it's tough, right? Because if your income meets your minimum expenses, then you don't have much to do, right? You don't have a lot of discretionary income to really enjoy the entire retirement that you want.
Yeah, no, that is so true. That is so true. And it's nice I will add, it's nice to be able to walk through that process with somebody who has some experience, because you're right. There are things that a lot of people just don't consider when they're getting ready to retire. I mean, even down to like simple things like vacations. Like you're used to being able to go on vacation whenever you've got time off, but maybe
that's right.
You got to think ahead a little bit when it comes to retirement and plan for it, right?
Yeah, when you have income coming in, it's a different story, right? Maybe you've got a bonus coming up that you use for vacations. You've got a tax return, what have you. When you're working and your income is coming to the household, that's one thing. But when you're on a fixed income, it really comes down to the budget, right? And maybe you can afford vacation for maybe one or two. It really depends on, what it will allow.
It's true. It's true. So what do you see as the most critical risk outside not properly allowing for your creating a budget that allows for your anticipated expenses? What do you think are the most critical risk for people being able to retire?
We always talk about really 5 critical things that are important to address. And this is important if you're doing financial planning and you're working with an advisor, or you're doing it yourself. And here are 5 things that I think are critical that you address when planning for retirement. Number 1, I would say, is longevity risk, and that is living longer in retirement, right? If you have a set amount of assets, how long will those assets last? And we call it stress testing in my world, where you see if a portfolio can withstand living to age 95, right? And so that's longevity risk. Nobody knows. One of the first things I always ask clients is, tell me about your family. How long are your parents still alive? What's the history like? And that'll give me a gauge for determining how long we should stress test the portfolio for longevity risk. Number 2, I see very often, is inflation. We certainly have inflation today. And inflation is, of course, purchasing power. So higher inflation, if you're not doing these financial stress tests against a really accurate inflation number, then the data is not going to come out correct, right? You may have a problem down the line. One of the biggest risks that I see is volatility. And what I'm talking about there is market risk, right? The stock market.
We're in a period, a little bit of that volatility right now, as a matter of fact.
We're certainly seeing that now. I mean, the S&P's down 10% in a very quick time this year. Every day you're seeing lots of uncertainty. So that's creating volatility. So, the portfolio and the stock market can have a huge impact, because especially when you're in retirement and you're drawing a certain amount of income from those assets, if the portfolio is dropping it's just devastating. You can run out of money very quickly. And so a lot of times it's really about timing, and you don't know if you're going to retire right before the markets are in a bull market, what they call is when markets go up, or a bear market when markets go down. And when you stress test a portfolio for that, that will tell you, you know, what kind of risk in this portfolio and how should it be invested. Two more things I think it's really important is survivorship. If it's a husband-wife couple, what happens in the event that one of the spouses passes away? You know, typically if they both are drawing Social Security or a pension, usually you'll definitely lose one of the Social Securities. And if they chose a pension that was only on the spouse, let's say the husband passes, and it doesn't continue for the wife, what happens? The household loses a significant chunk of income. So you have to stress test for survivorship and making sure that your spouse or your family would be okay in your absence. And there's different ways to address that. And finally, the biggest thing I think is taxes. How many people like to pay taxes these days?
Oh man, yeah. Wow, that is an impressive list and a lot to deal with. I can see why people are get kind of nervous when they think about the retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what it is a lot of people just have to go through the process, right? We put them through a process and we stress test all of these things and we factor them all, because we don't want them to get into retirement and then 10 years later, 15 years later, when they're in their 80s, you know, have an issue. Can you imagine trying to go back to work at that age or having to make difficult decisions about your household?
Yeah, no, oh man. You know, I don't ever want to stop working, but the idea of having retired and then realizing one day when I was 80, maybe I do need to go back to work here. That would be a hard thing to do. So what do you recommend that people do to get ahead of all of this?
You know, what we always recommend at Advisors 360 is, you know, you focus on prioritizing that income stream, right? So when we sit down with clients, we're focusing on the expenses, right? Making sure those are accurate, but also prioritizing the income stream that's going to come in. Is it sustainable? What's the right structure? What kind of income do they need? So I think that's the most important thing, is having the right allocation and filling the buckets for stability of income. They also need to, of course, stress test the portfolio for all the things that we talked about: inflation, longevity risk, those type of things. Don't forget the survivorship. You gotta make sure that you talk about what happens in the event that, one of you passes or both of you passes, what happens to your family.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to taxes, that requires a lot of work and with your trusted partners. So we work with a lot of CPAs. We're not tax advisors, but we know certain things can trigger higher taxes when it comes to taking money out of investment accounts. And so we want to be mindful of that and look for strategies that help maybe reduce taxes. The statistics look like we're going to be in for potentially higher tax rates in the future. So, that takes some of the purchasing power out of clients' household income.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into that.
Is there anything else in terms of like investment accounts that you maybe already have? Are there any options that you should be considering regarding them?
Yeah, there's a thing that's called Roth conversions. And that's when you take your qualified assets. And when I say qualified, that's like your 401k, 403b, anything that you've been deferring, but you haven't paid taxes on. There's a strategy where you can take that money, convert it into a Roth IRA. Once that money's in a Roth IRA, you'll never pay $1 of tax again, state or federal. So when people hear that, they're like, light up. I'm like, how do we do that? Well, it's not an easy process, because to do that conversion, you have to pay taxes on that money to get it into that Roth account.
Yeah.
Right. So in that can create layers of risk, meaning that taking that money and doing that conversion can push you up into the next tax bracket. You can go from a 24% to 32%. And people are thinking, why would I want to give up 32% of that asset to do the conversion? Well, the reason for that is, what if tax rates go above 50% again? And if that's the case, then it makes sense. So it doesn't always, and it's case by case, but it's certainly something that it's worth exploring.
Yeah, and I will add as a caveat, there are rules that govern that process. And if you're listening to this, talk to Mark or a financial advisor about whether those rules, and how those rules apply to you, right? That it's not necessarily something for everybody.
Absolutely. We want to give clients options. We want them to be realistic, and we want to make sure that they're fully prepared from the potential risk in retirement. And, that's one of our goals for this podcast, is to help educate people with options and know what the path is going forward, right? Some of the things that are important to be concerned about.
Yeah, if there's anybody who's listening to this podcast today, Mark, that they're not a client of yours already and they're thinking maybe they should have a conversation with you, how would they reach out and begin that conversation and possibly a relationship?
Yeah, it's really pretty easy to engage us. You book an introduction meeting. Typically that's 20 to 30 minutes. It's just a face-to-face. We want to listen to your story and understand about you. And then it really comes down to, and that I think through that process, an introduction process, and then, that's how we get started is just let's meet and have a conversation, and then we'll see where that goes. But we're definitely accessible. We've got many years of 2 decades of experience doing this, and we really want to help, for those that want that help.
I know this is going to be in the show notes. So for those of you listening, don't panic if you don't have a pencil or anything. What's the best way to do that? Do they give you a call? Can they email you?
That's both, Bill. They can give us a call. They can, send us an email. Our contact information is in the show notes. We also will provide a Calendly link that has access to my calendar. So you can go in and book a time, really convenient. Or you can come to the office. We'd love to see you in person.
And the other thing you can do is, if you're not a subscriber already, hit the subscribe button. That way, every time Mark puts out a new edition of his podcast, you're notified and you can give it a listen. And the other thing I would ask is, if you like the podcast, give it a rating. Tell people about it. Word of mouth promotion is most welcome. So until next time, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of Mark and everybody at Advisors 360. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Dollar Signs, Financial Clarity. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.advisors360pwm.com or give us a call at 408-778-8280. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Advisors 360. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.